So it is my great pleasure to introduce our opening speaker this morning, Ryan Kerr. Ryan is an activist, artist, and general communications expert who has lived in Toronto's Village for longer than he hasn't. He has written for both Fab and Extra magazines, as well as complete a self-published illustrated memoir called On Growing Up, a guide which has taken him across Canada, Europe, and the US. Ryan has presented as a keynote speaker at York University and Western University on topics of storytelling and coming out. In 2016, Ryan co-organized the #PulseTO Vigil in Nathan Phillips Square. He is the lead in capacity building in the evidence-based practice unit at the Ontario HIV Treatment Network. Without further ado, please join me in welcoming Ryan Kerr.
That guy sounds really great. He's done a lot of stuff. Good morning, everyone. Thank you for having me. It is an honor to be invited to speak to a room of people. Often we speak to each other as peers. It's even more exciting to be speaking to a room of new faces who are maybe not from within the sector or who are on the outskirts. There are also some friends in the audience, so that's nice. I decided to create a little bit of a speech, maybe to have some human element. So I wasn't here yesterday. I heard the programming was really exciting. And often in these conferences, we're looking at statistics and we're looking at what people, as numbers are bringing. And I thought I'd be an example, one person. I have stood up in front of lots of audiences and I have disclosed my gayness. I go to high schools and universities and it's like, ladies and gentlemen, a real live gay, and I get on stage and you can touch me. And they're like, wow, your t-shirt's also from H&M. And I'm like, that's right, children, I'm just like you. But here I stand in front of you and I tell you that I'm HIV positive, which I've never done before. So there are people in this room who know my status, but standing in front of a large audience and saying, I just celebrated my 10th posiversary is new. Thank you. And I will also tell you about my posiversary celebrations because I think it's important, to share the weird quirkiness and the humor that I use to kind of bounce back from some crazy situations. But I'll dive a little bit into how I got where I am. I was raised by my lesbian mother on a communal farm outside of Aurora, Ontario. So that's where the similarities about the H&M t-shirt kind of melt away when I'm speaking to other audiences. They're like, oh, you're a freak, actually. You're so different. My dad and my mom are still very close friends, although they're not together anymore as a couple. And when I went to public school in Aurora, Ontario, I was called faggot so many times that before the age of 7, I had to ask my mom what that was because I didn't, understand. And I felt a very strong sense all the way, and into adulthood too, of feeling outside of things and feeling like I didn't belong and trying to find inroads into belonging. And when I was thinking about how I got to where I am, a lot of that has to do with being on the outside, looking in, and defining myself as well, being an outsider. And so I think that was a very natural turn for me to become a bit of a performer and to learn to predict what people expected of me and to perform different characters and different versions of myself that would be acceptable. So obviously, when I was young, my dad thought that I should toughen up a little bit, so he put me in softball. Bit ironic. You'd think hardball would have had a better effect. And I have to tell you, I learned very quickly how to play softball. And I hit a double at the championship game, which is, thank you. I also, because, I've always been a gay person, I also played doctor with the coach's son. So it was a series of wins for me that summer. But it didn't really man me up, maybe in the way that my dad had thought it would. Later in life, I took boxing lessons because I thought that, what could be more manly than armed combat? And I remember in slow motion standing with my arms up, because you never want to let your guard down, and watching a fist come toward my face and thinking, why aren't they using their words? And getting clocked right in the face. Me and sports, we've always, had a difficult time. But when I moved to Toronto with my mom, we moved to Jarvis and Wellesley. So I went from, little, pigs and chickens and horses and communal living, which is a whole other situation, to transsexual prostitutes across the street from my third-floor apartment, and wondering sort of what that was all about. And there was quite a learning curve. I also went culturally from a public school where there were 3 people of color to being 1 white person in my whole grade in my downtown school. So there were some changes that happened. And of course, my sexuality was blossoming, and I was walking through the gay village every day, and I was like, gosh, these people, they seem to like sex a lot. I don't know. And I learned also that maybe that could be an in for me in this community. So the other thing that I just wanted to mention was being an outsider and feeling like an outsider. You do whatever you can to adapt. And bringing it back to like we're all the same, I think we all at some point feel like we don't belong somewhere, or that we have, we spend a lot of time, I certainly spend a lot of time defining myself by how I'm different from other people. And so, but the similarities that we share is we all want to be loved. We all want to have family around us. We all want to feel like we're part of something. And so when I was starting to come to terms with my sexuality, I was thinking about ways that I could, be loved. And this brings us to gay men's the sexual part of sexual health. My presentation is called Positively Forked. And that was, of course, a cheeky play on words, because forked sounds like, I'm not going to say it, you guys. But it also, to me, was like, when did I branch out? When did my life change in a really dramatic way? And of course, I was thinking about it in terms of my status. When did my discovery of my status change the direction of my life and alter it, irrevocably? And so I came to 2 conclusions. One was I picked a date when that happened. And then the other one took a little bit of time to sink in, which is that I wonder now if there was ever a fork in the road, or if I was just walking down the path that was laid out for me. And what I mean by this is when I came out to my mom, who, as I mentioned, is a lesbian. As far as I know, she's still a lesbian. Mom? Oh, she's not here. The first thing she said to me through tears was, "Don't get AIDS." And I remember at the time being like, Mom, we know each other, you're this isn't a gay disease, all of these things. And I came out when I was 16 years old, which was 19 years ago. But she immediately snapped to this rigid assumption that if I was going to be gay, then that was my destiny. And of all people, somebody who was in the queer community herself, I thought that wouldn't be happening. And I also looked around at the way that HIV and AIDS, anti-AIDS campaigns were hosted, and it was very fear-based. So there was a lot of talk about, you don't want to, you should use protection, right? Because if you don't, it's over. Everything that you know is going to be over. Your life will be over. There was never any representation outside of just don't, okay? And we won't talk about the alternative. Just do whatever you can to stop. And that fear made me so paranoid that I always use protection. How do you get here then, you guys? Well, I'll explain. this ties into wanting to be connected to people. And I went on a trip. I did a journey abroad in 2006. And I met this guy, and it was in France, and French people are notoriously cold and unfeeling, and this guy wanted to have sex with me, and I thought that meant that he was like in love with me and we were gonna get married, and I still sometimes think about that, but I guess it hasn't happened yet, so maybe it won't. And he wanted to have sex without a condom. And I thought, well, I mean, I know my status, he must also know his status, and this is the inroad to being loved, being accepted, to finding my way, and I was so excited about the whole thing. I mean, of course, we didn't have a discussion about it, it just happened. And after we had had sex, which was really fantastic, I said, wow, you must never do that, because I never do that. And he was like, well, I always do that. I never use protection. I would never want to know what my status was, because I'd kill myself if I were positive. And it's your fault if you thought it meant anything more than just a hookup. So I reflected back to my, very good Toronto hypochondriac upbringing and thought, well, then I have AIDS. Like, there's no point anymore in trying to prevent anything to change my behavior. I've got it now. And I felt so convinced that I stopped using protection with him, obviously. I was like, well, he's got it, I've got it, we're both dying. Like, let's just enjoy our last few moments on this earth together. And it sounds funny now to think about things that way, but that was really how my gay life was sold to me. That you have one slip up, and that's the end. And I came back to Toronto, and I very grudgingly went for an HIV test. But of course, I was nervous about it. And I remember telling the doctor that I'd had unprotected sex with this guy. And he said, well, that's not a guarantee. And I was floored. I had never heard anything like that before in my life. And then my test came back and it was negative. And so I thought, either I've been lied to this whole time about what my risks are, or my doctor's lying, or there was some sort of fluke of nature, or I'm very special and, the universe smiles on me in a specific fashion. But I started to wonder if everything that I'd been told was a lie, and if this whole narrative about gay sex and all of this stuff was a lie. And so, of course, the inevitable happened again. I started using protection, everything was fine, and then I got to this very down moment, which happened after a breakup. And, again, the breakup and all of my relationships, they're never my fault. They always end because the other person's a jerk. So again, this person, no fault of my own, decided that we shouldn't be together anymore. And I went to Craigslist. Remember when people used to do that? Yeah, not just for shopping anymore. Although now that we have Grindr, because this was pre-Grindr, I suppose people don't shop on Craigslist for the things that I was shopping for that particular evening. But I met this guy, and I also associated his interest in not using a condom as trust and compassion for my situation and care for me. And then, lo and behold, now 10 years later, here I am positive. So, these kinds of moments can happen to anybody, but when we look at the history of the HIV health world, and we talk about AIDS, there's something super fantastic about even the acronym of AIDS. And my friend Jordan Lewis was telling a story, this was a couple of years ago, to a group for Casey House. And he said, what's spectacular about AIDS is that there's morality built right into the name, because the first letter for AIDS is acquired. We don't talk about diabetes as being acquired. So we have this morality like right on there, that if you've got it, it's because you did something to deserve it. So that has been sitting with me this week as I've been reflecting about what to say. And then we'll go to my fork moment, when things got really forked up. I was finishing university, and this was in 2007, and I submitted my final paper, which I thought was really great. I started it at 10 p.m. the night before it was due, and handed it in at 9 a.m. that morning, and I did very well. So in case you were wondering, it was an excellent paper. But what was significant, of course, was that I felt like I had really done it. I'd finished my university. I was a U of T student. I had figured out how best I work. I'm a super procrastinator, and things work out for me. I had ticked all the boxes. I went to get my graduation photos, which were terrible, but and then I was going to fly away and just take some time to reflect and think about what my next steps were. And on the way to the airport, I was like, oh, and I'll get tested for HIV because it's January, nice time. And as soon as I landed at the airport in Charlottetown, Prince Edward Island, because, go as far away as you can, there was a voicemail from my doctor that said, there's been a problem with one of your tests, and we'd like you to come back in. And I only had one test, so it didn't take me long to start to panic. But of course, I was far away, so I couldn't go back to the city and figure out what was happening or right the wrong. And I started to bargain. And this I've learned is when things get tough, you start to bargain with some sort of higher power. This is what I do anyway. And I started to think about all the things that I could do in my life better if I just didn't get the HIV. And I was on one bargaining adventure, and seeing as we're now talking about mental health, I left my friend's house, and he had this beautiful house right on the edge of the ocean. And it was in January, and it was cold, and the waves were chopping, and there were pieces of ice that were lapping up against this huge red soil cliff. And I stood at the edge and listened to Sarah Bareilles' love song. You know that song? Not gonna write you a love song. Yeah. And I thought, you're so smart, but you did such a stupid thing. I guess you're stupid. You are standing on this cliff. The only thing that you have left to offer the world is disappointment. And I would love to say that I had this wash over me of pride or some sort of renewal of my spirit, but all I thought was, if you jump into the ocean and die, your parents will be saddled with your university debt, and that is a double shame. And I learned later that actually debts are cleared in that situation. So I would like to thank ignorance for being here today. But how is it that something like a disease or a virus can bring us to this point? What is so special about HIV that instead of saying, oh, crumbs, I better get some medicine, or I better see a doctor, I better call my family, the immediate thought is like, I am now officially worthless. So I, put on Sarah Bareilles and I walked away and I was like, well, better pay off that debt real quick so I can finally kill myself. And I flew back to Toronto and I ended up being tested again. And I'm a magic person, if you haven't already figured it out. So of course, the doctor magically ticked the wrong box for the test and I got the same result, which was inconclusive. And then ticked the box again. So it wasn't until February 26th that I received a phone call from my doctor saying that I was actually positive. And I was riding my bike at the time, and this was before headsets. I'm really dating myself. Well, I've already told you, you know my age, but here we go. So I'm like this, riding my bike. My doctor calls and says, your test results are in. And I said, for God's sakes, can you just, this has been a bit of a thing. And he told me, and I went straight to my favorite coffee shop, and I called my best friend, and he came, and we sort of had an action plan. I wasn't going to tell anybody else ever. That's funny because of right now. Definitely not my family. And it was going to be like a shame and a burden that I would just be saddled with for the rest of my life. And so after having several cappuccinos, which always makes you feel more calm, we were walking out together, and I had been riding my bike, and I had left my bag. I had like a little, bag on the handlebars of my bike. And my friend was just grasping at straws for something positive to say. So he's like, oh, see, life's not that bad. Someone could have stolen your bag and they didn't. And so, ever the drama queen, I fell to my knees and I said, oh, dear merciful Lord, thank you for sparing me my pen. And then we both laughed. And then he said, are you going to be okay? And I said, I think so. And he said, are you sure? And I said, I'm positive. You know, I work in the sector now, and this is a thing, do a time check. I work in the sector now. I work for the Ontario HIV Treatment Network. And I also do freelance video for a whole bunch of other organizations that are HIV affiliated. And, you know, this isn't so much a plug, although call me, as to say that, you know, when I found out that I was positive, and I also decided that I wanted to keep that as much of a secret as possible, it was difficult to hold on to that. And so I started to look for places where I could be long and where I could be open. And I started to fracture, so here's another fork, between my home life and personal life and my work life. And ironically, I was more open at work than I was at home. So I started to gravitate towards organizations like the GMSH and the OHTN. And I remember there being a posting they were looking for a videographer, and I was into technology. And they were looking for someone preferably with lived experience. And I had not really, you know, heard that term before, and my friend translated and said, they're looking for an AIDS fucker like you. And I said, oh! So sure enough, I wrote on my cover letter, you know, dear hiring committee, my name is Ryan and I am HIV positive. And according to the panel at that time, they had never seen anyone just, you know, throw their name in like this. And when I met them for the interview, they had my copy of my resume and my cover letter, and they had blacked out the first line due to confidentiality. And I appreciated it, but I also became aware of this strange double standard, that even within our sector, there's fear and shame and stigma that we are aware of so we can protect each other. And so it wasn't that this made me feel particularly unsafe. In fact, it felt very welcoming and comfortable. But I started to realize that those of us who have lived experience and those of us who work in HIV understand the particular, the delicacies in working in something and with something that is so, so taboo. Because we are talking about, you know, sex and drugs, and we're talking about gay people. I mean, these are the historical friends of, well, no one. And I mean, the fact that AIDS has acquired in its name, we're also not asking, you know, we've been socialized not to ask how you acquired it, but it's always on, you know, on the top of our minds. And when I started to try to date again, that was, you know, the first question. Was not like, oh, wow, you're positive. Like, how are you? It was, how'd you get it? And, you know, first I was like, I had sex. This is with someone I'm hopefully about to have sex with, and I couldn't feel more ashamed or disgusted that I'm even talking about sex. I mean, there's all these interesting things. Anyway, so being separated between work and home was an interesting thing. And I also started to realize with sexual partners that I would disclose to them before I would disclose to people I cared about. Another example is that I tested positive in February of 2008, and that June I sang at the AIDS Vigil. So here I was standing in front of 3,000 people, singing a song. My mom was like, oh, you're such a good singer, honey. And me like walking off stage being like, she doesn't even know. So then another fork happened, which is that my mom was diagnosed with cancer. And that was a really challenging time, as it is for most people, but what was really upsetting to me was seeing how people rally around more acceptable illnesses. So my mom said, I have cancer, and everyone just, gigantic group hug around her. People were coming from all parts of her life, contacting her are you okay? Is everything going well? How can we support you? And my mom held court in this really hilarious way where she sat down, and at dinner we were having some sort of a family dinner, and she said, I'm going to need all hands on deck for this one. And instead of being like, of course, Mom, my mom doesn't really sound like that, but if ever you see this, Mom, I'm sorry. But you have a funny persona as far as I'm concerned. So she sat and she proclaimed that we would all be working to help her. And instead of jumping to her aid and saying, of course, I thought, where were you when I needed you? Why wouldn't you be around me if this were to happen? And I started to realize that I couldn't keep this secret from my family any longer, that being a support and 100% in, for my mom and for her journey, for her health, specific her health journey, would actually be a huge detriment to my own. And so it was an interesting thing that is still to this day a bit of a strange wedge, because it's perceived that after 3.5 years of keeping my mouth shut, I suddenly wanted a piece of the attention pie at my mom's cancer party. And so that was another kind of breaking point with my family. And when I told my mom that I was gay, and she said, don't get AIDS, her response to HIV was similarly appropriate, which was, Mom, I have to tell you something, I have HIV. Forever? Yeah, I guess so. She loves me. We can't always judge people by their reactions in the moment. But I was like, well, it's a new one. My dad, on the other hand, was completely floored. He burst into tears and said, I wish you felt like you could have told me sooner. And so this resentment and all of this rage, this story that I come up with, that my family wouldn't be there for me, that people wouldn't love me or support me, immediately dissolved in that reaction. And yet I still carried this immense amount of shame. And the shame, the shame of action, so guilt and shame are defined as guilt being about regret of an action, and shame being about regret of who you are, or disgust with who you are. And there were moments like this where the shame would kind of like come up, that, in addition to letting myself down because I made dumb choices, I was letting my family down. So I have all these things written down. I'm like, don't say that. Don't say that. Relationships are tough, and they're tough for everybody. But when you enter the ring already feeling like poison ivy, like a character that is immediately at a huge disadvantage, I remember my very first reaction, like this visceral reaction to my status being, no one will ever touch me again. And I know that there are many people in this room who have experienced similar things, and I know that, that this is something that can also, as we age, right, we start to feel like less and less desirable, all of these things. But here I was, 25, feeling, like a sexual prime animal and feeling very undesirable. And so, of course, the first relationship I entered into was abusive, where this man had red flags all over him, but at least he would touch me. And I stayed with him until he just stopped returning my phone calls. And I thought, well, I guess he finally gave up. Like, he tried to date me, but it didn't work out because he realized that I wasn't good enough. And then we have Grindr, and we have blackmail, and we have all this criminalization happening, I was terrified to meet people because I didn't want them to reject me. I didn't want to tell people and have them reject me, and I didn't want to not tell people and have them sue me or send me to prison. And so I chose people with great intention, let's say. So one of the first people that I hooked up with after this relationship ended in fire and brimstone was, again, not my fault, totally not my fault, was this man who was studying HIV in university. In fact, he was doing his master's in HIV. And so I was like, ooh, he's going to be a friend. And we ended up fooling around, and it was really fun. And I didn't disclose to him because I thought, you know what, I'm going to give him a chance to like me first. This will be my hook. And he freaked out, and he threatened me. He defriended our mutual friend who had connected us. And he threatened to call the police. He threatened to tell all my friends. I had to block him from Facebook. It was like a really big thing. And I realized that that it was a very, very unkind world for people living with HIV. And again, this was a while ago. So things are changing now, and especially with criminalization sort of lifting. But again, it makes this sector even more important. And it made being at work and being out at work more and more important. How much time do I have? Oh, good. I think we're at an interesting point now where we look at Adam Rippon from the Olympics. I don't know. I mean, as you know, I love sport. But there's something really cool about seeing someone who is openly gay and openly flamboyantly gay, standing in front of audiences, wearing sparkly shirts and saying, this is who I am, and that's cool, and that should be cool. And I think we're at a place now where we need HIV visibility in the same kind of breath. I remember attending a World AIDS Day talk at City Hall, and the only people that would openly stand up in front of a camera and say that they were HIV positive literally felt like they had nothing else to lose. And they weren't necessarily examples of people that were thriving and integrated into society. They were people that were they were showing examples of how stigma had influenced their life, as opposed to talking about ways that they have done what they do and how well they do it. And that was part of my motivation for coming here today. I mean, that and being asked, so thank you. That I think we all need people who are examples of success or examples of effort and integration so that we can align ourselves and have examples in our work. So we can turn to people and say, like, you know, I think so-and-so, like I think Lupita Nyong'o, I don't know how to say her last name. She's HIV positive. That's amazing. I remember her saying, like, yeah, so. Like, there was an interview where she's like, whoa, yeah, I'm also an actress. I do a whole lot of other things. I think we're at a place now where we can, where those of us who have been hidden or shy or sheltered, we maybe have the space now to say, like, okay, I'm okay. There is another side to all of the advertising that we've heard. The before and the after are both important phases that we need to integrate into our psyche so that when we're talking to people and we're listening to people, we have a balanced perspective. I also think that with this room, in this room, we have an incredible opportunity because you are potentially mine or future people like me's caregivers. You're part of my care team. I can go up to you, hopefully any one of you, and say, like, you know, this thing happened. I was like rejected by another guy and it feels really terrible. And you can think, I bet you it hurt more because of your status. Or I can say, you know, I was talking to my therapist and he was really focused on just the sex part of what I was saying. And you can say, I bet sex is more complicated for you because you tie it to your status. And I also think that, if I come up to you and I say, so, haven't been sleeping super well, and I think it's because of this new medication I'm taking, you can say, I bet every time you take that pill, it occurs to you all of these things that the reason why you have to take the pill, how much the pills cost, that it feels worse than just a little bit of insomnia because you're HIV positive. And so it's kind of my hope today that by sharing a little bit with everybody in this room, you get a little insight into what the day-to-day can be for me, certainly not for everyone in this room, and that you can see with greater eyes, greater perspective, the day in the life of me. I want to leave some time for questions, if anyone has any. So hit me. Thank you.
It's not so much a question as a comment. I just want to thank you because part of your story kind of really put a focus on something that I really struggle with in terms of how we talk about HIV in the sector, and that's about people who are risk takers. And we label groups as being risk taker groups when I think, and I loved your example of, well, it was a really bad day, or this bad thing happened. And I think anybody can be a risk taker. So I just wanted to thank you for that.
Thanks. Yeah. Thank you. It's very interesting to me what we consider to be taboo and risky and what we don't. And I live at the corner of Yonge and Wellesley, and I see people jaywalking all the time, and I am a very proud jaywalker. And people get killed all the time when they cross the street because they don't cross at a crosswalk. And there are lots of people who are staunchly opposed to jaywalking because it's a very bad thing. And then there are the rest of us who take our lives in our hands, and yet, yeah, there's different associations with quality of risk and the morality behind it.
Hi. Oh, goodness. Thank you for sharing so much your personal perspective. I was just wondering if you feel like, in kind of casual, oh, thank you. I'm not so good at that part. If you feel like there's a constant pressure to feel like you have to kind of justify your decisions and justify yourself more than would be seen in like other diseases that people could catch maybe through contact with others, or like do you feel like people expect like a whole story and not just like it was like I just have this and maybe I don't want to explain my whole life to you more
Yes.
than other things?
Yeah. I'll give you an example. So Grindr is really fantastic. I'm totally addicted to playing on my phone, and I love looking for sex and feeling desired, and Grindr, hooray. But I oscillate between having my status on my profile and not. And there are some categories on Grindr, so you can say what your tribe is, which I think is sort of a little bit of a dangerous term to begin with, but you could say that you are pause. And then you can search for other people of that tribe. And what I found was that people were searching for pause people so that they could either use me as a social worker or like disclose to strangers and kind of talk it through, or talk about their suicidal ideation at 11 p.m. on a Saturday night on Grindr, and expect huge return. Like, I just tested positive. How did you get it? Like, what did, and this feeling that I owed them some sort of a personal story to help them get through. So that would be like in support of other pause people, I feel a lot of pressure. But then, meeting new people, the question, you can always see the question of like, how did you get it? And I used to say like, well, I did a stupid thing, like we all do sometimes, like everybody makes mistakes. And I started to say like, what difference does it make to you? How much do you care about me that if I had a blood transfusion, if I were Ryan White, the so-called innocent, would that change your perspective of me? Because we're not talking about my actions, we're talking about like who I am at this point. So there's always pressure, and it's kind of what changes is how I deal with that pressure. And especially in this sector, I feel a pressure to disclose because it adds legitimacy to my position or to my work. And I shy away from that because I want people to, just like we all do, we want to be seen for who we are. We don't want to be seen for that, like the suitcase that we drag behind us. Does that answer your question?
Yeah, no, I think it does. I just, I feel like there's certain positions where people, I find like even just socially or like within, I guess, like professional positions where there seems to kind of be like more of a pressure to, I feel like you have to speak up and be like, yeah, I am this person, even if you don't necessarily feel comfortable being that person quite yet. It's kind of like, oh, but you should be a champion, be like this, be the face of it, yeah.
Yeah, and the you watch celebrities, for example, like, there's a supermodel, Niall something or other, terrible with last names. But anyway, he's hard of hearing. Actually, I think he's deaf. And so he's become this impromptu kind of advocate for the rights of hearing people because he suddenly has this attention on him. But at the end of the day, like, he's not interested in, he wants to like meet people and communicate with people on a level of, like, the other thing is what happens is you other people when you put them in this position. Mm-hmm. Right? Like, you brought me into this room today, and I'm cognizant of the fact that I might be remembered as the HIV positive guy, which is what I'm here to talk about, and that's okay. But it would be also cool if I was the guy that sat next to you and had lunch, and you also remembered my name, which is Ryan. That sort of stuff, right? And so we have to be careful, especially when we unintentionally nominate others to be the spokesperson. And there's been a lot of talk at our workplace around what an ally can be. And I personally feel like if you're compassionate, then it's easy enough for you to understand certain aspects of being HIV positive in a field that you care about. Mm-hmm. So you don't have to be HIV positive to care about people that live with HIV. Yeah. And you don't have to go through sexual abuse to understand that trauma is a horrible thing.
Yeah, for sure. Thank you.
Thanks.
Hi, Ryan.
Hi.
Marco Posadas. You mentioned a couple of times suicide
Mm-hmm.
and suicide ideation, and I wonder if you can speak a little bit about what helped you not to kill yourself,
Mm-hmm.
and how did you manage? Because I was hoping to hear for a story where then you talked to a therapist and they were there for you. And just like so many other stories of people I get to my office that they have never talked to someone about this. So the strategies that you had are super important. So I wonder if you can speak a little bit. Thanks.
Let's get right in there, you guys. So I don't know if you noticed from my story about how I found out, but my first doctor screwed up several times. So my first doctor ticked the wrong box on my HIV test because the first one came back inconclusive, which prolonged the experience of me being in this no person's land where I was bargaining with a higher power and freaking out about everything. And then when he finally told me, he told me over the phone, which we know is not really a best practice. The other thing he told me was, I am going somewhere with this. The other thing he told me was that if I wanted to take my time before I came to see him or any professional, take as long as I need, which we've also learned is not best practice. Then I went to a second doctor. I told him about my experience, and I only went because a friend dragged me and said, "You're not in care? Like, what are you doing?" And I was like, "Oh, I don't know. He said I could take some time." She's like, "That's not what I've heard." So she took me to another doctor. And this other doctor said, "Oh, it's a shame you didn't come sooner because your viral load was so low, we could have maybe run a course of drugs and maybe knocked it out because there was a thought that you had been so recently infected," or something like that. So that was great. Then I talked to this doctor about seeing a therapist because I thought that would be a great idea. And the first therapist I saw was very specifically interested in how I got HIV. And so I explained to him, in a similar thing, a very general term. And then he's like, no, like, what action? Like, what? So, I'm at my most vulnerable. I'm crying, like I'm not, and I'm like, what? And he wanted to know, like, he wanted me to not be afraid of sex and to really just like embrace sex and, not let this bother. And it was not a direction I was interested in going. And the next thing that was kind of the final red flag with him was he suggested that I don't tell people about my status until we were actively having sex. And I said, well, would that be safe? Like, what if that person, because you know how sex gets people really excited and their emotions are running high, would that be safe for me if that person rejected me? And he was like, oh, I never thought of it that way. So then I bounced to another therapist who would fall asleep while I was talking to him. And his way of kind of working through that was to drink tea. And it was like a get out moment where he'd be stirring his teacup methodically while he was falling asleep. So my experiences where I was accessing care were botched. They were just terrible. And I started to really, at first I had this feeling that I was going to carry this burden of shame by myself. And then I started to feel like even if I wanted to, there wasn't going to be anyone out there. And so I would say the intervention. So then I ended up getting into a relationship with this guy who I thought was really fantastic. And I didn't realize until we broke up that being in that relationship was also a huge relief. That I didn't have to be in this, playing this game of looking for love and being rejected and taking risks and all that stuff. Like I had this one solid, guy. But when we broke up, that coupled with the fact of like, oh my God, I'm not going to grow old with this person. Maybe I won't grow old with anyone. Like all these feelings came in. And I remember I'm a music theater kid. So I was talking to a former music theater kid as well. And I said, Sarah, when you go to an audition and you do really, really well and you still don't get it? And she said, yeah. And I said, I don't think I want to audition anymore. And she looked at me with tears in her eyes and said, you're going to call my therapist? She costs money, but you're going to do it. And if I have to pay for it, I will. And I went to this therapist and I was such a mess. She was like, I have a sliding scale. We can see you like as many times as you want for free. Like we'll figure this all out. And I started to build a relationship with a counselor. But it was outside of the system that I was told I was meant to access, right? And it was working through her that really brought me. And so I would say like the irony is that while HIV is such a core driver of this shame that we feel, or that I feel in lots of things in my life, it uncovered a whole bunch of other things, as therapy is wont to do. And so we never really got to that place before I ran out of money and had to stop seeing her. So I'm in a place now where I'm trying to balance my financials, and it's a challenge, and so I'm hoping to be able to afford to continue that relationship. But for the 2 years that I saw her, that kind of let me forward. Well, the microphone's gone. Do you want to? Okay. I'll just stand here awkwardly. Thank you. Okay, so I'm going to go. Yeah. Okay.